Nowadays, Thornton-le-Street is a picturesque and quiet village set in the rolling fields of North Yorkshire between the towns of Thirsk and Northallerton. The enigmatic lumps and bumps in the surrounding fields tell us that something else was happening here in the past. During the Middle Ages, Thornton-le-Street was a much larger settlement, and nearly 2,000 years ago, a Roman road ran somewhere near the village. Only one small archaeological investigation has ever been undertaken in Thornton-le-Street, and so the local community set out to discover more about their village's past. With a grant from the National Lottery and the generous support of the landowner and Historic England, a team of volunteers and local archaeologists set out to answer a series of questions. Where was the Roman road? What was life like in the medieval village? Why and when did it shrink from its heyday in the Middle Ages? Thornton-le-Street sits on the eastern side of the Vale of Mowbray, a wide area of fertile farmland between the Pennines and North York moors. It's a landscape cut through by rivers and defined by the broad gravel terraces and clay ridges laid down in the last ice age. People have lived in the Vale of Mowbray since the retreat of the glaciers around 12,000 years ago. The pioneer tundra soon became a resource-rich wild wood, and we still find the stone tools of our Mesolithic ancestors scattered across the landscape. After the advent of farming during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, the Vale was clearly a special place. The henges at Thornborough were great circular gathering places or ceremonial monuments, the meaning of which has now been lost to us. Standing stones were erected, and the dead were honoured in ornate funeral rituals and placed for eternity beneath earth and stone mounds. By the time the Romans arrived in the north, they found a populous and settled farming landscape to supply their forces with food and natural resources. Their early forts and marching routes became the towns and arterial roads of the Roman province. Indeed, the modern A1 still follows the line of the Roman Deer Street through the Vale of Mowbray. The volunteers were eager to get going, and so the first trench we opened was in one of the front gardens in the village. We wanted to start tracing the historical route through Thornton-le-Street and also see if there were surviving building foundations close to the old road.
It's taken quite a number of years to get this project to the point where we're actually on site and digging now. We've known that there is this shrunken medieval village around Thornton-le-Street. That's been known for, well, probably centuries. But we don't still understand exactly how the village worked. We don't understand where the manor was. We don't know whether the church is on its original site. We don't know whether what we're digging here is someone's house, a small farm, something industrial like a blacksmith's maybe. And there's always the question as well that it's been suggested that there's a Roman road running through the middle of the village. So there's so many questions to answer, and the problem I think we're going to have is that we're not going to have enough time to answer them all, or we're going to end up asking more questions. So it's genuinely really nice to finally get on site and open a trench. I'm kneeling on a whole bunch of big stone cobbles. These have probably come up out of the river. They've been dragged up because there isn't a lot of quarried stone around here. And they've been laid down in what looks like a really rough floor or a yard. So we can be fairly happy that we're probably in front of a building here, and this is the big yard surface. Now, when this was laid down, we don't entirely know. This is why we're digging through it at the moment. So you can see we've got a line here. We're excavating this part of it. Want to get down to the bottom of these stones, and hopefully we'll find something underneath, and that will give us a handle on when this was created, when this was built. What I've got here, this is really the only bit of early pottery that we've found out of this end of the trench anyway. It doesn't look like much, but you can see sort of the curve of the piece, so we know it is a piece of pottery. It's not a stone or anything. And this 2 tone, this change in colour, the outside to the inside of the pot, that suggests that it's medieval in date, because it means it's been fired in the kiln quite inefficiently. It means that it's not completely fired all the way through and is therefore still a little bit soft in places. Once we get out to the medieval period, big industrial kilns mean that pottery is fired a lot better. There's a noticeable change in how it survives and what it looks like. So that takes us back potentially into the medieval period, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. But then from just above the stones in this end of the trench, we've got these, which actually, these two pieces fit together, which is the bowl of a clay pipe. So tobacco going in the end and lit, and there would have been a long stem coming off here. And we find hundreds, thousands of these on sites, but obviously they date from after tobacco was introduced. So these date from a lot later than this piece of pottery, and this shows that what we've definitely got people living, working, moving around here in what we call the post-medieval period, which is from the middle of the 16th century onwards. And these, in fact, clay pipes we find them right the way up into the start of the 20th century.
As our excavation of Trench 1 came to a close, it became clear that we had revealed the line of the earlier, possibly medieval, road through the village. It was our first taste of the fascinating remains to be uncovered. During this early part of the excavations, we also dug several test pits around the village. These are small trenches that can be excavated over the course of a day or two, and the finds that come from them can show us how the village developed.
The top of the jug would have been like that, and then this handle would have come down that side, and it probably would have had another one here, and it would have been really quite a tall jug for holding liquid, possibly beer, or maybe water.
The surviving mill in Thornton-le-Street is 17th century in date, but we know that there was at least one medieval mill in the village.
What's the find situation like? At this depth, are you really getting nothing?
Not even a stone.
Not even a stone. Okay, well,
Can we just plod on?
yeah, just half the width of the pit. Then that's fine, and try and get down towards natural clay.
So where do you get your volunteers from, Jim?
He grabs us off the street.
Institutions.
Some of these fine people I've been working with for many years, and you can probably tell which ones.
I'm not saying anything.
It's a really nice mix. This project we've got, there's people I've worked with on previous projects. There are people who have quite a lot of experience. There are people with absolutely zero experience of archaeology who have come to learn and get involved. And there's a really nice amount of people just from the village and the surrounding area, including Bill, who are coming to get involved. So it's genuinely based on Thornton-le-Street. That's the really nice thing here. There's an interest in learning more about the village and its surrounding area, and it's the local people doing it. It's fantastic.
As soon as we were uncovering new information, we started to invite the public to a series of open days, telling the story of medieval Thornton-le-Street to people from the surrounding area.
The underlying banner, well, the overarching banner that all of these activities are under that we've been doing, it's a Heritage Lottery funded project based initially looking at the archaeology of Thornton-le-Street as a village. That was where the original idea came. It grew sort of through the application process, and as we started the project, to encompass a lot of the landscape immediately around Thornton-le-Street as well. It's obvious that one of the main hooks here was the idea that Thornton-le-Street stands on the line of a Roman road, but we also have the scheduled medieval village, so we already knew there was multi-period archaeology here. We're here today. This is the launch for the 2018 season. So we've been digging test pits, we've been field walking, we've been excavating through 2017. We found some fantastic stuff, and now we're about to launch ourselves into sort of the final year of the project. We're looking forward to a big excavation just down the road and also down at the moat site. We're looking forward to more field walking and a huge amount more archive research. So today's sort of the launch of that, and we've had so far a fantastic turnout, far bigger than expected, so the enthusiasm of the volunteers has really buoyed us up quite a lot.
One of the main questions we set out to answer was about the enigmatic causeway along the centre of the medieval village. Was it the missing Roman road, or was it something later?
So we're walking down basically to the end of the village. This is the line of the old road. Basically under this house it turned off and went to where the main road is, but hundreds of years before that the road continued all the way directly through here, what is now just a track up to people's houses. As we walk out a little bit further here, we get to the open fields, the farmland, but this is where we can still see all the lumps and bumps, what we will call earthworks, that are the remains of the shrunken medieval village. So these are the little roads, the streets, the platforms, the places where these small steadings that we call toft and croft settlements. So a house at the front and then a long narrow strip of land where people could keep animals, almost like allotment farming, so self-sufficiency. This is very characteristic of medieval settlements, and all of this whole land out here down to the mill there and even beyond is covered with these earthworks. This is all what we call scheduled, so it's protected by law. And this is really the core, the heart of the medieval village.
Welcome to Trench 2, the Causeway Trench.
Trench 2 is looking at this causeway feature that runs on a sort of a north to south alignment from Thornton-le-Street up towards the river up there. What we found in this trench when we took our topsoil off is a stone-packed causeway feature. So we have a stone-packed road here, and this appears to be over a number of phases. So the initial phase of the metalled surface, the road, stretches from these stones down here, which seem to represent some sort of slipped curb, over to another alignment of stones on this side here, which represents the other curb.
Here, underneath the medieval road, this bank that forms a later extension to the road, we've dug out all the material that forms that right down to the natural clay. Just on top of the natural clay, we've got these great big stones here, these flat top stones that we've only found just in one or two places, but it's just possible that right underneath all of this later material, we've got just a possible idea, a possible sniff of an earlier road surface.
The Church of St Leonard in Thornton-le-Street was built in the 12th century, though most of it was remodelled in Victorian times. In the medieval period, the church would have been an important building. Indeed, religion held sway over many aspects of life, and the great bishops and monastic houses held considerable power.
Here we are at Fountains Abbey. Fountains Abbey is a Cistercian monastery, and that's the reason essentially that it was founded. Some of the monks from St Mary's Abbey in York decided they wanted to follow a much more strict rule, a much more strict, rigid, harsh life. Because of the strictness of the way of life of the Cistercians, they decided not to devote much of their time to the manual labour and instead employed laymen, secular men of the landscape. And this was due to the fact that they had so much land. Over 200 places were owned by the monastery here at Fountains. And on this land, they would therefore farm, and that's where the majority of their wealth came from, sheep and therefore wool. So here we are in Fountains Abbey Scriptorium. And what's important about this is it shows just how widespread the influence of the abbey, and in fact monasteries in the Middle Ages, were, not only in ecclesiastical and political affairs, but in art. If we didn't have the monasteries, we wouldn't essentially have any of our manuscripts, any of our art. This was where it began. It was the monks.
We had already discovered a great deal about the form and layout of the medieval village, but we wanted to know more about the people who lived there. So, in August 2018, we opened a trench over one of the medieval houses.
We're here in Trench 7. We've taken the opportunity while all the volunteers are away at break to sort of sneak in and have a look at where we're at. A little bit of an opportunity. From this end then, We think if I stand here in this ditch, this sort of ground sloping down here, we think this is the main road through the medieval village. It's got this causeway built in it now, but we're pretty sure that's later. So from here, up this slight slope, about here is where we think the front of a stone platform is. So these are the properties, these are the houses of the people who lived here. Whole long row of long, narrow properties, normally called toft and croft in terms of medieval villages. And we've got a house at the front. Might have to take my word for that at the moment. We think we've probably got a front wall somewhere around here. There'll be a floor somewhere under here. We're just getting down into it now. There's been a lot of pottery and animal bone come out. We think we've probably got, this is the remnants of the back wall of the building. So, I mean, it's a good width. It's a reasonable width. We're looking here, we've clearly got some kind of ditch running along behind the building. Again, there's been a lot of pottery, lots of animal bone, and some daub has come out the back. Well, it's pretty interesting. We've taken the top out of this ditch, but it looks like it's got lots of different fills. So it's been cut, it's been cleaned, it's been sort of refilled over and over again. So that could be a really valuable source of information. Then there's a backyard, for want of a better word. And then here, I'll hop over. I'm stood on the remnants of a rear bank. So running along all the way behind me and all the way back towards the modern village, there's this very slight bank. It's difficult to pick out on the ground, but as we're getting down, we're starting to see the form of it. And this is the division between what we call the toft, which is where the house is, the front, the enclosure with the house in it at the front facing on the road, and the croft, which is the long piece of the property, which, if we think of it as a small holding, I think that's probably the best modern analogy. This is the piece of what we think is daub that's just come out of the ditch behind the building. Particularly nice. Daub is part of wattle and daub walling. So it's this idea that you've got a wattle, or sort of like almost like a wickerwork fence, that is then caked in daub, which is a mixture of cow dung and clay and straw, and it bakes hard and it forms this weatherproof wall. This piece in particular, we think it's daub because it's got little marks where we can see where the straw was pressed against it and parts of it, and we think in the back here there's a shallow channel in it that looks like it might have been where it was actually pressed against the wattle of the fence. So that's a really nice piece of evidence that starts to give us a little bit more of an impression about what these buildings would have looked like on the site here. Stone. It looks like we've got a dog print in here. Yeah. Dog footprint on the top of this tile. It's quite nice.
We're digging this out to make a longer slot that's going to be maybe 5-10 centimetres down, just to see what's here. And Jess has found a lot of cool stuff.
What's Jess found?
Oh yeah, Jess.
So I found a tooth of some creature and a slate that had like an animal paw in it, like a footprint. So that was probably when it was actually drying that like a dog had like gone into the stone, which is quite cool.
I found another tooth, but it was
no one cares about.
Considerably smaller.
It's been overshadowed by Jess.
Hasn't found anything, so she's taking the mick.
Oh,
You found worms. You found a worm.
I found worms, yeah. I found worms.
Are they ancient worms?
Yeah, ancient worms. Really old worms.
And what are you guys, why are you here?
Because we told this was fun.
It is fun!
No, I think it's probably more pure interest.
Yeah.
I don't know how many 18-year-olds can say they've done an archaeological dig.
Yeah, haven't done it before, so.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
After the excavation finished, specialist analysis of samples from the trench showed us that the house was occupied in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. The people who lived there grew many different types of crops, including barley, oats, and several varieties of wheat. Their diet also included mutton, beef and food gathered from the surrounding hedgerows such as hazelnuts. Fascinatingly, closer examination of the daub showed that it was probably from a domed bread oven in the yard behind the medieval house. We were connected to the past residents of Thornton-le-Street and their daily lives through the fragments of pottery, animal bone and metal that they had thrown away.
When things come out of the ground, they get put into little bags, and as you can see, they are quite dirty. So we clean everything, make it nice and neat, and what that actually reveals is a lot of the glazing on some of the pottery. So for example, that one you can kind of see there's a bit of green glaze. It has faded a bit on that one, but sometimes you get a lovely piece like this, which kind of comes out, when it came out of the ground, it was completely caked in soil, but now we can actually see it had a really lovely, nice medieval green glaze on it. You can see that that is actually a rim of a pot, so it would have gone all the way around in that angle, so that could have been for storage, because it looks like it would have been quite a large piece. What's really interesting is you can actually see the wheel throwing lines from when they actually made the pot, so it gives you a bit more of a connection as to how it was actually made. This one, for example, we know that that's a handle, so we're missing the top and the bottom of it, but we know that that would have been used as a handle. We've got another rim there. It's a bit of a wider jug, so that could have that was probably been for storage, so things like wine and oils and things like that. It's also got a lovely little green glaze on it, so we know we can date that. These bones were actually found at Moat site, and the reason that they've gone this odd sort of colour, normally bones are a bit lighter, is because it's a waterlogged site. They were found at the very bottom of the ditch, and that's made them quite it stained them a sort of brown colour. But the fascinating thing about these particular bones is that once we've had a look at them here after they've been cleaned, is these actually fit together, these bits of vertebrae. So we know that this has come from a single animal and it was a single deposition. So what we can do is find out a bit more about what kind of animal it was, and if there's any butchery marks, whether it was used for food or whether it might have died of natural causes. So bones can actually tell us quite a bit, but it's always nice when you find some that actually fit together. This bottle was also found at Moat site. It was actually found at the topsoil. So it actually is a mineral water bottle from Northallerton, and we've actually gotten a date on it. So the company was around sort of start of the 1900s, between 1900 and 1905. So what that gives us is an upper date.
Some of the finds that we've had out of Trench 4 so far. So we've had some bits of animal bone coming out, which is quite nice. It's likely to be good datable evidence, and hopefully it'll tell us what people are eating around here, because that's likely to have been discarded from someone's dinner. You've got some bits of nails and bits of metalworking, which again is showing probably household waste, but we could also be looking at cottage industry, so sort of smithing, forging and other metalworking practices. So we have another lovely bit of animal bone coming out there. This is a bit of CBM, or ceramic building material. So ceramic building material covers everything from brick to tile, any sort of house or dwelling related material. And again, these bits here are lovely. These are some lovely bits of late medieval pottery, which again provides us with a good dating evidence. And although they're not very colourful, we are able to then create more of a story from them to say, right, these were household goods, these were household objects. So it is likely that we're looking at household waste being thrown in the ditch and littered around the site. So like what people do these days, unfortunately. But it's still a good evidence as to what people are eating, what people were using, and how people were using them.
Whilst we don't know for certain where the medieval manor house was in Thornton-le-Street, we also investigated a moated site a few miles to the south. Although heavily overgrown, the deep moat still survives, and we set out to uncover whether this was part of the medieval story of the Vale of Mowbray.
Our trench behind me, and you can see that now it looks great with this carpet of buttercups, but what our trench has shown us is that you had quite a deep wet ditch here, a deep moat around this rectangular enclosure, within which you would have had buildings around the outside of the enclosure, not in the middle, probably an open yard with a gatehouse perhaps, and in there you've got people living and working now. We know from our trench that we've got metal working going on at this site, which we hadn't expected. We've got a huge ditch that surrounds the site, but this ditch is probably not really a defensive ditch. It's more about showing off. It's the idea that you should have a moat around your site if you're at a certain status. This is the trench that we've cut across the moat behind me, the ditch, and across both banks as well, the bank on the inside and a bank on the outside. And we set ourselves some questions with this trench, trying to work out what date this site is, and also a little bit about what was happening here, the purpose and construction of both the ditch and the banks. And really, this trench has been great in that it's given us those answers to those questions. So we've managed to get right down into the bottom of the ditch and get finds out of there that are going to help us to date this feature that ultimately defines this whole site, runs all the way around it in a big rectangle. So one of the questions we set ourselves about this trench, and one of the reasons for digging this trench, was to get down into the ditch fills in the bottom of this ditch, which is where we hope to get lots of finds out that informed us about this site. And as we went down in those ditch fills, we got from the later stuff at the top, earlier and earlier and earlier as we went down into the ditch. Right in the top, we got a great, lovely, complete glass bottle from the Friarage Mineral Water Works in Northallerton, which told us that sometime around 1905, 1910, someone was out here drinking their mineral water with their lunch and throwing their bottle into this ditch. But even earlier than that, as we went down and down into the ditch fills, we got material that told us about the life of this site when it was actually in use. And we got information about the types of buildings that were in this site. So for instance, here we've got a medieval roof tile, a stone tile, slate, which has been shaped flat and then had a nail hole drilled through it. So here we've got animal bone, butchered, cooked, used and thrown away as rubbish into the ditch, and that's given us information about what people were eating. One of the questions we had for this trench was to find out about date. One of the best ways of doing that is pottery, and right out the very, very bottom of the ditch we've had this lovely green glazed medieval pottery, which really starts to help us date this whole site. Finding that right on the bottom of the ditch is great, and for an archaeologist you couldn't hope for more than that. But as well as all of that stuff that we hope to find in terms of dating the site and understanding what people were eating and the social status of the people who were living here, we also got information about their work, and this is something we didn't expect to find on a site like this. But this is metalworking slag, it's metalworking debris, waste from that process of creating metal objects.
Through the diligent work of volunteers in the local archives, we have even been able to give names to some of the medieval and post-medieval landowners and residents of Thornton-le-Street. In the centuries following the Norman conquest, the lands around the village were part of the vast estates of the de Mowbray family in the north. It was discovered that the moated site we excavated was the medieval manor of Woodall, one of the homes of the de Mowbrays through the 14th and 15th centuries. The archive work also gave us important clues to help unpick the archaeology of the village. The will of the local lord John Talbot in 1572 told us that the causeway through the middle of the village was repaired, maintaining the path between the manor house and the church. Having spent 2 years researching the village's past, we now know a great deal. Although we weren't able to definitively locate the Roman road, we have a wealth of evidence and new targets for our continuing quest. We know about the thriving medieval heyday of Thornton-le-Street, the families who owned the estate and the lives of the people who tilled the land.
So this is it. We're done. Last afternoon of the last day. As you can see sort of behind me, hopefully people are working hard. It's been hot, sweaty, it's been a very warm day. Closing everything down now. This is always the bit where sometimes volunteers don't quite appreciate the amount of work that goes into putting all the soil back, but this lot have just been fantastic. It's sort of a perfect analogy for the last 2 weeks in many ways. Everyone's just pitched in, everyone's had a fantastic time, even when the going's tough. We've got the answers we want, and now we're filling the holes back in and going home.
Overall though, this has been a story of the volunteers that have come together to make new friends, learn new skills and celebrate their common history.
I didn't really know what to expect. I knew it was going to be hard work, but it's been quite exciting.
Great, really good. And I think most people who've come have had a good time, because we have tried to include new people.
Cooperation between the professionals, the experienced volunteers.
The things we've found, the friends we've made as well, which is quite important, and the learning experience has been brilliant.
I think my favourite finds have been the very old stuff from the bottom of the moat, which was medieval pottery and slag.
I like finding bits of bone, and I like spotting things that other people have missed.
Loads of new friends. I mean, we've set out deliberately to be warm and welcoming with everybody, and everybody's really got on, whether we're having a cup of tea, a piece of cake, biscuits, or even talking about the dogs. It's been a really good, warm, welcoming experience.